I made a recent video titled that we might be unhealthy without even knowing it. And while I made some good points in that video, I felt that the overall message could definitely be greater. And so in this video, I'm just going to go through some specific things and go into a more deep and detailed dive into some of the good points that I made in that video, but could still definitely be expanded upon. But first, as always, subscribe and stick around to the end to implement these tips and tricks into your life. Now, in this video, I mentioned the 5 stages of your body reacting to getting in and getting out of bad and unhealthy habits. And the first stage in this 5-stage cycle is the initial response. And this can be anything from the response that your body has when you first eat some sugar, when you first drink coffee, or when you first drink alcohol, or anything of the sort. And many people don't actually remember the first time that they tried something. And this is why many people are on the stage of adaptation, which is the second stage. And this is where your body adapts to protecting itself from these unhealthy substances that you may be eating. For instance, the lung cells in a smoker, whether smoking, we know that that's an unhealthy habit. The lung cells in a smoker develop a protective sheath around themselves, like a chemical sheath. And this means that the chemicals and carcinogens inside of the tobacco smoke cannot damage the cells as prominently as they could before. And that leads on to the third stage, which is exhaustion. And this is when your body cannot adapt anymore to the potentially bad things that you may be eating or doing inside of your lifestyle. And this is the stage where many people start to experience sudden health problems, and it's usually when they go to see a healthcare professional. And then the fourth stage is recovery. And recovery is where they're told to give up this kind of stuff. They start to give up maybe things like sugar or cigarettes or alcohol completely and entirely because they understand the actual effects that it's having on their body now. And then the fifth stage is hypersensitivity. After going on the recovery period for maybe 6 to 12 months, when they try the thing that they were recovering from again, they're going to have a much more adverse reaction to it, a much more adverse initial response compared to the first time they tried it and compared to when they carried on doing it during the stages of adaptation. And this shows you that maybe the things that we are eating in our society aren't necessarily good for us. Maybe the things that are in our environment aren't necessarily good for us, and it's just the fact that we're quite used to them. Maybe our environment and the things that are in our environment are actually quite damaging to us. I mean, you've heard of things like plastics and tap water and the pesticides that are sprayed on our fruit and vegetables. You've probably heard of all this stuff containing a lot of harmful and unhealthy chemicals that have adverse reactions on our endocrine systems and on our bodies in general. But the fact is, we probably don't remember the first time that a plastic or a pesticide or anything of that kind of sort had a big effect on our body. Because the fact is, this stuff doesn't really have a massive effect on your body in the short term. The first time that you drink out of a plastic water bottle, there's not going to be too many microplastic chemicals inside of the water, and it's not going to have that much of an effect. When you do this kind of stuff, unbeknownst to you, for multiple years, it ends up having a massive effect in the long term, and your body has to adapt to actually defending itself and protecting itself against these kind of chemicals. And because this build-up, this initial response is kind of unnoticed, we end up thinking that we are quite healthy people, despite the fact that there may be things in our environment that are actually hurting our systems and our body in general. For instance, tap water and plastics and things like pesticides, we've probably eaten and used this kind of stuff when we were 4 years old, and that may seem quite worrying when you know that this kind of stuff is quite bad for you. But when you just eat one piece of fruit that has maybe some pesticide on it, it's not going to do too much damage in the short term, and there won't be too much of an initial response. And therefore, people keep eating things like fruits and vegetables that have pesticides on them completely unknowingly, and it ends up having an adverse reaction in the long term, but their body ends up adapting and putting energy into protecting itself while it's still, the pesticides are still damaging their body, but they don't really notice it because their body is trying to protect itself. And this is why I say in the title that we're not living to our best potential, because there are things in our environment like plastics, like tap water, and like fruits and veg that have been sprayed with pesticides. All this stuff has an effect on our bodies, and our bodies are required to adapt to protect itself against these chemicals. And when our body has to adapt against these chemicals, just like the lung cells in a smoker have to adapt to the lung smoke. It takes up a hell of a lot of energy. And even though that you may feel fine and feel healthy, you could be a lot healthier if suddenly things like tap water that contains bad and heavy minerals and things like hormones and stuff and pesticides and like plastics and stuff, if all this stuff was suddenly eradicated from your environment, you may find that you would be a much more healthier and productive and happier person than what you would have been and what you previously thought was even possible. Because when this kind of stuff affects our bodies and our bodies have to adapt to it, it takes up a lot of energy. You have to imagine the chemical reactions that take a lot of energy to produce the kind of protective sheaths against the smoke against the lung cells inside of a smoker. You have to imagine the amount of energy that it takes up to do the chemical reactions that produce that kind of substance to protect the cells against the carcinogenic chemicals. And the same thing is going to apply to things like plastics and tap water and pesticides. Our body is in the long term going to have to put in so many defense systems and defense mechanisms in place to these like plastic and microplastic and like hormones and pesticide chemicals. And it's going to take up so much energy, but we don't even realize it because we're actually quite used to this kind of stuff. I mean, even me, I am probably not as healthy as I could potentially be, and while I consider myself above average in this kind of stuff, like I go to the gym, I don't eat sugar, the fact is I still unavoidably am exposed to things like pesticides. I can't just not eat fruit and vegetables. I'm still exposed to things like plastics in my environment, for things that are completely unavoidable, like my desk veneer or something. All this kind of stuff does have an effect on your bodies, but because it's not like such a big effect in the short term, over the long term, the plastic like toxic chemicals will build up and our body will have to adapt to protect itself. And this in the long term takes up a lot of energy. And on a day-to-day basis, you may find that you could be so much more productive of a person if all this toxic stuff was completely eradicated from your environment. And I like to use the analogy of a metal box. Imagine that you were placed inside of a metal box and you were never ever exposed to things like the plastics, tap water. You had access to water, but it was like clean water that had been distilled and had electrolytes put in it that were healthy for you. And imagine that all the food that you ate was perfectly clean. It was still good food, and the good food that you ate wasn't tampered with, like the meats and stuff the cows hadn't been fed some harmful chemicals or had hormones injected inside of them to build muscle better. All of this kind of stuff, you had like nice, free, clean food. You had access to a gym and stuff inside a massive metal box so that you could actually kind of keep fit and keep your hormones to a good level. And you had access to everything that was able to make you healthy. And you stayed inside this metal box for 1 year. And all the air inside this metal box was the purest, cleanest air that you've ever seen. Because even the air that we kind of breathe in today, inside of our cities, inside of our towns, is nowhere near as clean as you may think. I mean, you may have experienced the weird thing where like your nose kind of hurts. When your nose like hurts, I used to get it when I was walking to school sometimes, like where all the cars were driving past to drop kids off and like stuff like that. All the exhaust fumes would absolutely destroy my nose, and it would like this lingering ache and pain would last for hours inside of my lessons and stuff. And this is an example of things like the air that we breathe being not as clean as it could like possibly be, and our bodies will adapt to this kind of dirty air. And as like the lung cells in a smoker do, the cells inside of our respiratory system are going to adapt to be able to protect itself against these harmful chemicals. For instance, there are things like microplastics that are inside of the air, and microplastics are chemicals that have come from plastics but have sort of leached off into the environment and now are just like floating around, and we breathe them in and then we breathe them out, and they do end up having an effect on our bodies even if we don't really notice it. And our bodies could be using energy to protect itself against these kind of stuff, and this means that we may not be as productive as we may want to be. And back to the kind of metal box analogy, if you put yourself inside of a metal box with the cleanest, purest air, access to fitness gyms, access to the cleanest tap water, no plastics, whatever, the cleanest food, imagine you stayed in there for a year, and then you went outside into the actual world, you would probably have quite an adverse reaction to things like plastics, to things like pesticide sprayed foods, to things like meat that has been where the animal that the meat came from has been injected with loads of different kind of hormones and chemicals to make them, like, the meat grow bigger and be tastier and stuff like that. Imagine that you went out into the real world. You would probably find that you have so many adverse and hypersensitive reactions to things like the tap water chemicals, things like the hormones and the heavy minerals like lead inside of tap water. You would probably find that you would be very hypersensitive to all of this stuff. And it's quite interesting when you think of the fact that, like, all this stuff that's in our environment, we're so used to it. Yet if you somehow miraculously managed to do the kind of metal box thing, if you stayed in there for a year and then went out again, you would probably find that, like, many of the plastics, many of the tap water chemicals, pesticide sprayed foods, and hormone injected meat, all this kind of stuff would make you severely ill, because now your body has been on a recovery while being inside that kind of metal box, so that it can, like, become its best and most happy and productive self. Yet all this stuff actually did have an impact on you, and you can see how bad this stuff actually was for you when you were just in the normal real world. So I hope you found this video nice and educational, and how you understand that there are so many things in our environment, even stuff like the water we drink and the air that we breathe. All of this stuff, while it may not have effects in the short term, our body ends up adapting to protect itself against the harmful chemicals inside of these substances, and this means that we may not be living to our best potential. So, as always, I recommend subscribing, because I like this community of young tribal men who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.